Morning, page 68, chapter Cherry Brandy, part 5. It's a poem here. So who cares? I don't, of late. Let me tell it to you straight. Life is candy, cherry brandy, ain't that dandy, sweetie pie? Where to a Helen gleamed beauty, to me from black holes gaped shame, where Greeks sped Helen over waves, salt foam spits in my face, emptiness smears my lips, poverty thumbs its nose. Oh yeah, oh ho, this ale ain't no cocktail, but life is candy, cherry brandy, ain't that dandy, sweetie pie? It's Osip Mandelstam, March 2nd, 1931. That the poet was dying. His hands, swollen from hunger, with their white, bloodless fingers and filthy overgrown nails, lay on his chest, exposed to the cold. He used to put them under his shirt, against his naked body, but there was too little warmth there now. His mittens had long since been stolen, to steal in the middle of the day. All a thief needed was brazenness, a dim electric sun, spotted by flies and shackled in a round screen, was affixed to the high ceiling. Light fell on the poet's feet, and he lay as if in a box, in the dark depths of the bottom layer of bunks that stretched in two unbroken rows all around the walls of the room. From time to time, clicking like castanets, his fingers would move to grasp for a button, a loop, a fold in his pea jacket, to sweep away some crumbs, come again to rest, and come again to rest. The poet had been dying for so long that he no longer understood that he was dying. Sometimes a thought would pass painfully, almost physically through his brain, a simple, strong thought that they had stolen the bread he had put under his head. And this was so acutely terrible that he was prepared to quarrel, to swear, to fight, to search, to prove. But he had no strength for this, and the thought of bread became weaker. And now he was thinking of something else, that they were supposed to take everyone abroad, but that ship was late, and that it was a good thing that he was here. And in the same haphazard fashion, his thoughts shifted to the birthmark on the face of the barracks orderly. He spent a large part of his days thinking on the events that filled his life here. The visions that rose before his eyes were not those of his childhood, youth, success. All his life he had been hurrying somewhere. It was wonderful now that he did not have to hurry anywhere. Now that he could think slowly, and in a leisurely fashion, he began to think of the great monotony of death. He thought of the things that had been understood and described by doctors before artists and poets had come to them. The face mask of the dying Hippocrates is known to all medical students. The mysterious monotony of movement before death launched Freud into the boldest of hypotheses. Monotony and repetition form the compost essential to science. But as for that which is death, the search was led not by doctors but by poets. It was pleasant to realize that he could still think. The nausea of hunger had long since become a habit, and it was all the same. Hippocrates, the orderly with the birthmark, and his own dirty fingernails. Life was entering into him and passing out of him, and he was dying. But life came back, his eyes opened, thoughts appeared, only desires were absent. He had long lived in a world where people were frequently returned to life by artificial respiration, glucose, camphor, caffeine. The dead lived again, and why not? He believed in immortality, in real human immortality. He often thought that there was no biological reason for a man not to live forever. Old age was merely a curable disease, and if it were not for this still unresolved tragic misunderstanding, he could live forever, or at least until he got tired. But he wasn't at all tired of living, even now, in these transit barracks. The barracks were a harbinger of horror, but not horror itself. On the contrary, the spirit of freedom dwelt here, and this was felt by all. Ahead was the camp, and the prison was a thing of the past. This was the peace of travel, and the poet understood this. There was still another path to immortality that the poet Tuchev, that of the poet Tuchev. Blessed be he who has passed through this world in his fateful moments. But though he was evidently not destined to become immortal in his human form as a physical entity, he had nevertheless earned creative immortality. He had been called the first Russian poet of the 20th century, and it occurred to him often that this was really true. He believed in the immortality of this verse. He had no pupils, but what poet can tolerate pupils? He had also written prose badly. He'd written articles too, but only in verse did he find anything that seemed new and important to him. His past life had all been a fiction, a book, a fairy tale, a dream. Only the present was real. These thoughts arose calmly, secretly from somewhere deep within him. There was no passion in these meditations. Indifference had long since possessed him. What trivia this all was, what nitpicking in comparison to the evil burden of life. He was amazed at himself. How could he think of poems when everything was already decided? He knew all this. He knew better than anyone. Better than who? Who cared about him, and who was his equal? Why did all this have to be understood? He waited, and he understood. In the moments when life poured into his body, his half-clouded, half-open eyes began to see. When his eyelids began to quiver and his fingers to move, in those moments thoughts came to him, but he didn't think they would be his last thoughts. Life entered by herself, mistress in her own home. He had not called her, but she had entered his body, his brain. She came like a verse, like inspiration. And for the first time, the meaning of the word inspiration was revealed to him in its fullness. Excuse me. Poetry was the life-giving force by which he had lived. Yes, it had been exactly that way. He had not lived for poetry. He had lived through poetry. Oh, Evil Burden is a reference to the Mandelstam's poem Notre Dame. Now it was so obvious, so palpably clear, that inspiration had been life. On the threshold of death, it was revealed to him that life had been inspiration, only that, inspiration, and he rejoiced that he had learned this final truth. Everything, work, the thud of horses, hooves, home, birds, rocks, love, the whole world, could be expressed in verse. All life entered easily into verse, and made itself comfortably at home there. And that was the way it should be, for poetry was the word. Even now stanzas rose easily one after another in some sort of foreordained, but at the same time extraordinary rhythm, although he had not written them down for a long time, and indeed could not write them down. Rhyme was the magnet with which he selected words and concepts. Each word was a piece of the word and lent itself to rhyme, while the whole world rushed past with the speed of a computer. Everything shouted, "Take me, no me." There was no need to search, just to reject. It was as if there were two men, one who composed, who spun the wheel, and another who, from time to time, stopped the machine, and seeing that he was two men, the poet understood that he was composing real poetry, and who cared if it was written down or not? Recording and pointing was the vanity of vanities. Recording and printing, excuse me. Only that which is born selflessly can be born equal. The best was that which was not written down, which was rejected and disappeared, melted without a trace. And only the creative labor that he sensed and could not possibly confuse with anything else proved that the poem had been realized, the beauty had been created. Could he be wrong? Could his creative joy be an error? He remembered how bad, how poetically helpless Bloch's last poems were, and how Bloch did not seem to understand that. The poet forced himself to stop. It was easier to do that here than somewhere in Leningrad or Moscow. Now he realized that for a long time he had not been thinking at all. Once again, his life was departing from him. He had been lying motionless for many hours when he suddenly saw something near him that looked like a shooting target or a geological map. The map was mute, and vainly he strained to comprehend what was depicted on it. After a considerable period of time, he realized that he was looking at his own fingers. His fingertips were still stained by the homemade cigarettes that he smoked and sucked to the very end. The pads of his fingers revealed clear dactyloscopic drawing, like the relief map of a mountain. The drawing was identical on all 10 fingers, concentric circles like those of a sawn-off tree trunk. He remembered once how a Chinese man from the basement laundry in the building in which he grew up had stopped him on the street. The man had chanced to take him by one hand, then seize the other. The man turned the palms upward and excitedly shouted something in Chinese. It turned out that he was declaring a child so marked to be unquestionably very lucky. The poet often recalled that sign of luck, especially when he published his first collection of verse. Now he remembered the man without anger or irony. He just did not care. The main thing was that he still had not died. Incidentally, what did it mean when they said someone had died a poet? There must be something childishly naive in such a death, or something intentional, as in the case of Asenin or Mayakovsky. Died an actor, that was more or less comprehensible, but died a poet? Yes, he had an inkling of what awaited him. At the transit prison, he had understood a lot and guessed at still more. He rejoiced quietly in his own weakness, and hoped he would die. He remembered an argument that had taken place a long time ago in prison as to which was worse, camp or prison. Now one had the experience to make a judgment, and the arguments were speculative. He remembered the cruel smile of a man who had been brought from camp to the prison. The smile stuck so clear in his memory that he was afraid to recall it. If he were to die now, he thought how cleverly he would have deceived those who had brought him here. He'd cheat them of 10 whole years. He had been in exile several years before, and he knew that his name had been entered into special lists forever. The scale by which he measured everything had shifted, so that the meaning of the word changed. Again he felt a nascent tide of strength rising, just like the tide from the sea, a flood tide that lasted many hours. Later came the ebb, but after all, the sea doesn't retreat from us forever. He would still recover. Suddenly he wanted to eat, but lacked the strength to move. Slowly and with difficulty, he remembered that he had given today's soup to his neighbor. That mug of hot water was his only food for that day, except for bread, of course. But the bread had been handed out a very, very long time ago, and yesterday's bread had been stolen. There were some who still had enough strength to steal. He lay like that, light and ethereal, until morning came. The electric bulb grew dimmer, more yellow, and bread was brought on large plywood trays, as it was brought every day. But he could not rouse himself any more, and he no longer watched out for the heel of the loaf or cried when he didn't get it. He didn't stuff the bread into his mouth with trembling fingers. The smaller of his two pieces slowly melted in his mouth, and with all his being, he felt the taste and smell of the bread, of the fresh rye bread. The bread was no longer in his mouth, although he hadn't managed to swallow or even to make a movement with his jaw. The smaller piece had melted and disappeared. It was a miracle, one of many local miracles. No, he was not upset. But when they put the daily ration into his hands, he seized it with bloodless fingers and pressed the bread to his mouth. He bit the bread with loose teeth from scurvy. His gums bled, but he felt no pain. With all his strength, he kept pushing it into his mouth, sucking it, tearing it, gnawing. His neighbor stopped him. "Don't eat it all, leave some for later. And the poet understood. He opened his eyes wide, not letting the blood-stained bread slip from his dirty, bluish fingers. When later, he said clearly and distinctly, and he closed his eyes. He died toward evening. They wrote him off 2 days later. For 2 days, his inventive neighbors managed to continue getting his bread ration. The dead man would raise his hand like a puppet, so he died before the recorded date of his death, a not insignificant detail for his future biographers." How sad. Just a second. A child's lungs. They didn't have any lists when they took us out for work assignments. Just us, in groups of 5, since not all the guards knew their multiplication tables. Any arithmetical computation is tricky when it has to be done with live objects in the cold. The cup of convict patience can suddenly overflow, and the administration knew it. Today we had easy work, the kind they normally reserve for criminals, cutting firewood on a circular saw. The saw spun, knocking tightly as we dumped an enormous log onto the stand and slowly shoveled it. slowly shoved it toward the blade. The saw shrieked and growled furiously. Like us, it detested working in the north, but we kept pushing the log forward until it split into two unexpectedly light pieces. Our third companion was chopping wood, using a heavy blue splitting axe with a long yellow handle. He worked on the thicker pieces from the ends, chopped the smaller ones in half with one blow. He was just as hungry as we were, and the axe struck the wood in a feeble fashion. But the frozen larch split easily. Nature in the north is not impersonal or indifferent. It is in conspiracy with those who sent us here. We finished the work, stacked the wood, and waited for the guards. Our guard was keeping warm in the building for which we'd been chopping wood, but we were supposed to march back in formation, breaking up in town into smaller groups. We didn't go to warm up, though, since we had long since noticed, next to a fence, a large heap of garbage, something we could not afford to ignore. Both my companions were soon removing one frozen layer after another with the adroitness that comes with practice. Their booty consists of lumps of frozen bread, an icy piece of hamburger, and a torn pair of men's socks. The socks were the most valuable item, of course, and I regretted that I hadn't found them first. Civvies, socks, scarves, gloves, shirts, pants were prized for people who for decades had nothing to wear but convict garb. The socks could be darned in exchange for tobacco or bread. I couldn't reconcile myself with my companion's success, and I too began to use my hands and legs to break off brightly colored pieces of the garbage pile. Beneath a twisted rag that looked like human intestines, I saw, for the first time in many years, a blue school notebook. It was an ordinary child's drawing book. Its pages were all carefully and diligently colored, and I began turning the bright, cold, naive pages, grown brittle in the frost. I also used to draw once upon a time, sitting next to the kerosene lamp on the dinner table. A dead hero of fairy tale would come alive and touch the magic brush as if it contained the water of life. Looking like women's buttons, the watercolors lay in their white tin box, and Prince Ivan galloped through the pine forest on a gray wolf. The pines were smaller than the wolf, and Prince Ivan rode him like an Eskimo on a reindeer, his heels almost touching the moss. Smoke spiraled in the blue sky, and the neat V's of birds could be seen among the stars. The more I strained to recall my childhood, the more clearly I realized that it would not repeat itself, and I would not encounter even a shade of it in the drawing book of another child. It was a frightening notebook. The northern city was wooden, its fences and walls painted in a bright ochre, and the brush of the young artist faithfully duplicated the yellow color wherever he wanted to show buildings and creations of man. In the notebook there were many, very many fences. The people and the houses in almost every drawing were surrounded by even yellow fences and circumscribed with the black lines of barbed wire. Iron threads of the official type topped all of the fences in the child's notebook. Near the fences stood people. The people in the notebook were not peasants or hunters. They were soldiers, guards, and sentries with rifles. Like mushrooms after rain, the sentry booths stood at the feet of the enormous guard towers. On the towers, soldiers walked, their rifle barrels gleaming. It was a small notebook, but the boy had managed to paint into it all the seasons of this native town. The ground was bright and uniformly green, as the paintings by the young Matisse, and the blue sky was fresh, pure, and clear. Sunrises and sunsets were conscientiously crimson, and this was no childish inability to capture half-tones, color shifts, or shading. Nor was it a Gauguin-type prescription for art, where everything that gave an impression of green was painted in the best green color. The color combinations in the schoolbook were a realistic depiction of the sky in the far north, where colors are unusually pure and clear and do not possess halftones. I remember the old northern legend of how God created the taiga while he was still a child. There were few colors, but they were childishly fresh and vivid, and their subjects were simple. Later, when God grew up and became an adult, learned to cut out the complicated patterns from his pages and created many bright birds, God grew bored with his former child's world and he threw snow on his forest creation and went south forever. Thus was the legend. The child remained faithful in his winter drawings as well. The trees were black and naked. They were enormous deciduous trees of the Darien Mountains, and not the firs and pines of my childhood. The northern hunt was on, and a toothy German shepherd strained at the leash held by Prince Ivan. Prince Ivan wore a military hat that covered his ears, a white sheepskin coat, felt boots, and deep mittens. Prince Ivan had a submachine gun slung over his shoulder. Naked, triangular trees poked out of the ground. Were poked into the snow. Naked, triangular trees were poked into the snow. The child saw nothing, remembered nothing but yellow houses, barbed wire, guard towers, German shepherds, guards with some submachine guns, and a blue sky. My companion glanced at the notebook rubbed a sheet between his fingers. Find some newspaper if you want to smoke. He tore the notebook from my hands, crumpled it, and threw it on a garbage pile. Frost began to form on the notebook. Condensed milk. Envy, like all our feelings, has been dulled by and weakened by hunger. We lack the strength to experience emotions and seek easier work, to walk, to ask, to beg. We envied only our acquaintances, the ones who had been lucky enough to get office work, a job in the hospital or the stables, wherever there was none of the long physical labor glorified and heroic and noble in signs above all the camp gates, glorified as heroic and noble in signs above all the camp gates. In a word, we envied only Shestakov. External circumstances alone were capable of jolting us out of apathy and distracting us from slowly approaching death. It had to be an external and not an internal force. Inside, there was only an empty, scorched sensation, and we were indifferent to everything, making plans no further than the next day. Even now, I wanted to go back to the barracks and lie down on the bunk, but instead I was standing at the doors of the commissary. Purchases could be made only by petty criminals and thieves who were repeated offenders. The latter were classified as friends of the people. So, 1 moment. So, the latter were classified as friends of the people. There was no reason for for us politicals to be there. We could not take our eyes off the loaves of bread that were as brown as chocolate. Our heads swam from the sweet, heavy aroma of fresh bread that tickled the nostrils. I stood there, not knowing when I would find the strength within myself to return to the barracks. I was staring at the bread when Shestakov called to me. I'd known Shestakov on the mainland in Butir prison, where we were cellmates. We weren't friends, just acquaintances. Shestakov didn't work in the mine. He was an engineer geologist, and he was taken into the prospecting group in the office. The lucky man barely said hello to his Moscow acquaintances. We weren't offended. Everyone looked out for himself here. Have a smoke, Shestakov said, and handed me a scrap of newspaper, sprinkling some tobacco on it, and lit a match, a real match. I lit up. I have to talk to you, Shestakov said. To me, yeah. We walked behind my barracks and sat down on the lip of the old mine. My legs immediately became heavy, and Shestakov kept swinging his new regulation-issued boots that smelled slightly of fish grease. His pant legs were rolled up, revealing checkered socks, and I stared at Shestakov's feet with sincere admiration, even delight. At least one person from our cell didn't wear foot rags. Under us the ground shook from dull explosions. They were preparing the ground for the night shift. Small stones fell at our feet, rustling like unobtrusive gray birds. Let's go farther, said Shestakov. Don't worry, it won't kill us. Your socks will stay in one piece. That's not what I'm talking about, said Shestakov. He swept his index finger along the line of the horizon. What do you think of all that? It's sure to kill us, I said. It's the last thing I wanted to think of. Nothing doing. I'm not willing to die. So, I have a map, Shestakov said sluggishly. I'll make up a group of workers, take you and we'll go to the Black Springs. That's 15 kilometers from here. I'll have a pass and we'll make a run for the sea. Agreed? He recited all this as indifferently as he did quickly. And when we get to the sea, what then? Swim? Who cares? The important thing is to begin. I can't live like this any longer. Better to die on your feet than to live on your knees, Shestakov pronounced the sentence with an air of pomp. Who said that? It was a familiar sentence. I tried, but lacked the strength to remember who had said those words and when. All that smacked of books was forgotten. All that smacked of books was forgotten. No one believed in books. I rolled up my pants and showed the breaks in the skin from scurvy. You'll be all right in the woods, said Shestakov. Berries, vitamins. I'll lead the way. I know the road. I have a map. I closed my eyes and thought. There were 3 roads to the sea from here, all of them 500 kilometers long, no less. Even Shestakov wouldn't make it, not to mention me. Could he be taking me along as food? No, of course not. But why was he lying? He knew all that as well as I did, and suddenly I was afraid of Shestakov, the only one of us who was working in the field in which he'd been trained, who had set him up here, and at what price. Everything here had to be paid for, either with another man's blood or another man's life. Okay, I said, opening my eyes, but I need to eat to get my strength up. Great, you definitely have to do that. I'll bring you some canned food when we can get it. There are a lot of canned foods in the world. Meat, fish. fruit, vegetables, but best of all was condensed milk. Of course, there was no sense drinking it with hot water. You had to eat it with a spoon, smear it on bread, or swallow it slowly from the can. Eat it little by little, watching how the light liquid mass grew yellow and how a small sugar star would stick to the can. Tomorrow, I said, choking from joy, condensed milk, fine, condensed milk, and Shevkov left. I returned to the barracks and closed my eyes. It was hard to think. For the first time, I could visualize the material nature of our psyche in all its palpability. It was painful to think, but necessary. He'd make a group for an escape and turn everyone in. That was crystal clear. He'd pay for his office job with my blood. He'd either kill us here at the Black Springs or bring us in alive and give us an extra sentence, 10 or 15 years. He couldn't help but know that there was no escape. But the condensed milk. I fell asleep, and in my ragged, hungry dreams saw Shestkov's can of condensed milk, a monstrous can with a sky blue label. Enormous and blue as the sky, the can had 1,000 holes punched in it, and the milk seeped out and flowed in a stream as broad as the Milky Way. My hands easily reached the sky, and greedily I drank the thick, sweet, starry milk. I don't remember what I did that day, nor how I worked. I waited for the sun to set in the west and for the horses to neigh, for they guessed the end of the workday better than people. The work horn roared hoarsely, and I set out for the barracks, where I found Shestakov. He pulled 2 cans of condensed milk from his pockets. I punched a hole in each of the cans with the edge of an axe, and a thick white stream flowed over the lid onto my hands. You should punch a second hole for the air, said Shestakov. That's all right, I said, licking my dirty, sweet fingers. Let's have a spoon, said Shestakov, turning to the laborers surrounding us. Licked clean, 10 glistening spoons were stretched out over the table. Everyone stood and watched and ate. No one was indelicate about it, nor was there the slightest expectation that they might be permitted to participate. None of them could even hope that I would share this milk with him. Such things were unheard of, and their interest was absolutely selfless. I also knew that it was impossible not to stare at the food disappearing in another man's mouth. I sat down so as to be comfortable and drank the milk without any bread, washing it down from time to time with cold water. I finished both cans. The audience disappeared. The show was over. Shestakov watched me with sympathy. You know, I said, carefully licking the spoon, I changed my mind. Go without me. Shestakov comprehended immediately and left without saying a word to me. It was, of course, a weak, worthless act of vengeance, just like all my feelings. But what else could I do? Warn the others? I didn't know them, but they needed a warning. Shestakov managed to convince 5 people. They made their escape the next week. 2 were killed at Black Springs, and the other 3 stood trial a month later. Shestakov's case was considered separately because of production considerations. He was taken away, and I met him again at a different line 6 months later. He wasn't given any extra sentence for the escape attempt. The authorities played the game honestly with him, even though they could have acted quite differently. He was working in a prospecting group, which shaved and well-fed, and his checkered socks were in one piece. He didn't say hello to me, but there was really no reason for him to act that way. I mean, after all, 2 cans of condensed milk aren't such a big deal. Thank you so much for listening. Have a good day.